Afua Bruce. Great. Amy is the CEO of N10, a nonprofit creating a world where missions and movements are more successful through the skillful and equitable use of technology. Amy has also published Social Change Anytime, Anywhere, a Terry McAdam Book Award finalist. Afua is a public interest technologist whose career at the intersection of technology, policy, and society has spanned government, nonprofit, private, and academic sectors, including time at a data science nonprofit, the White House, the FBI, and IBM. Thank you both for taking the time to visit us here at the Beck Center and speak with us about your new book, The Tech That Comes Next: How Changemakers, Philanthropists, and Technologists Can Build an Equitable World.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. We'll just dive in if that's okay with everyone. I'll start with the first question for Afua. In our current world of short form media like blogs and podcasts, can you talk a little bit about how you decided to write a book?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you again for having us. And just so excited to see this Tech and Society Week at Georgetown. I know that there's so much great work that goes on in Georgetown broadly, but definitely through the Beck Center. And so I'm super honored to be a part of that today. There is a lot of competition for ideas and thoughts and a lot of opportunities to engage quickly and, as you said, in short form communication. But one of the challenges that I think Amy and I realized, just based on our decades of experience in doing technology in the social impact space especially, is that the solution to building a more equitable world is not easy. It's not quick. There's no short answer. If there were 10 basic steps, 10 easy steps, just follow these to build an equitable world, we would have already done it. But the reality is that's not the case. And so to really dive into thinking about how can we change our relationship to developing technology, to designing technology, to deploying technology, to funding technology, to using technology, especially in the social impact space, but even more broadly speaking, it's a conversation that we are going to need more than a couple of tweets on, even some long Twitter threads on. We'll need more than a few TikToks and Insta stories on that. And so in the book, we were able to dive deep into a few different frameworks, but really also to highlight a lot of great ongoing work that is happening today, examples of people really doing the hard work today to build a more equitable world.
Great, thank you. Amy, I know this is far from your first book, and I'm curious, do you find writing to be energizing or exhausting for you?
Oh, interesting question. You know, I think that if I was writing a book report on what I learned, you know, about a subject matter that I'm not interested in, like I learned about rocks and here is my geology paper, you know, rocks are interesting. There are great geologists. I am not one of them. And I don't think that would be energizing. But, you know, I think that Afua and I both were, you know, interested in writing this book together and interested in taking on a project like this where we wrote the book in such a short period of time, because it's incredibly energizing as a topic for us. This is our life's work. This is the work that we want the world to be doing and engaging in. So it was really exciting. And I think I was just going to add to Afua's first answer, you know, part of what was exciting about having to write so many words was that we didn't have to lose all the nuance that you have to cut out to write a single tweet, right? Like we could actually spend a whole paragraph setting the stage for the point we were trying to make. And I think that is also what made us so interested in including so many other voices in the book, both from quotes from people as well as, you know, real case studies of their work and what they're already doing, because we wouldn't have to kind of shortchange the recap of what they are thinking or doing as well. There was space to really share a bit of the fullness of what this work already looks like. You know, while we're trying to introduce big ideas or not even introduce them, but really kind of highlight big ideas, there's also a real need that we felt to share that it is already happening. People are trying to answer these questions. People are doing work in different ways. And hopefully that's also energizing to readers that, you know, it's not a huge burden of let me try and go somewhere that no one's gone before. People are trying to go there, and we can go there together. And that's really the invitation. Great,
thank you. And then I'll just add a comment for the audience. If throughout the talk today you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll save time at the end to, of course, answer those. Great. In the book, you write, quote, "The responsibility of distributing power lies in the hands of technologists." You go on to provide guidelines for technologists, particularly those in this room and at the Beck Center, the people that wield this awesome power. How do you think about education and training for technologists as they enter the social impact world so they can use that power much more responsibly?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things to key on in your question is for technologists as they enter in the social impact world. I think one of the things that I have certainly seen is that, technology skills are great in general. I'm an engineer. I love technology. I love all things engineering. It is my happy place. But when you are working in the social impact sector, you really need to take extra time to really understand some of the cultural context in which you're operating. And that might mean that, you did all of this great work in an organization in the private sector someplace, and now you're going to have to invest a little bit of time and energy, not just working on the technology, but really understanding what it means to develop solutions along with communities, in partnership with communities. The community-centered solutions are really what make a difference and make an impact in the social impact space. And so techniques that you can use are, having more listening sessions, really partnering intentionally with organizations who are in the community, really thinking about how can you involve community members in your design process. Is that sharing features and sort of prioritization of features in that process. One of the examples that we have in the book is the story of Rescuing Leftover Cuisine, which is an organization started in New York City that exists, as you might imagine, to rescue leftover cuisine and distribute it to people who are facing food insecurity. And we talk in the book about how that organization was able to, with the intentional use of technology, able to expand to operating in 8 cities across the US. But throughout their development process for that technology, they brought in the community input. They opened up their board where they were prioritizing features and bugs that they were fixing to make that process more transparent, to allow people, including some community members, including some volunteers, to weigh in and to help prioritize that process and then to communicate it back out. So really figuring out what that looks like if you are working directly in the social impact sector. Now, I'll also say that doesn't mean that just because you aren't working in the social impact sector for most of your time, part of your time, that you are somehow absolved of needing to think about community and the use of community. There are many examples of how technology that is developed, for profit in the private sector, then disproportionately harms usually people of color and other historically overlooked and disadvantaged communities. And that's also in part because as we have traditionally trained technologists, we've traditionally trained engineers like myself to focus simply on the technology and not on how do we mitigate bias, how do we reduce bias in the solutions that we develop, how do we make sure that a facial recognition system, for example, will recognize people regardless of gender, regardless of race. How do we make sure that autonomous cars will be able to react to someone in a wheelchair or a different shaped sign that it wasn't familiar with before? And so regardless of whether you're in the social impact sector or wherever you're developing technology, really thinking about how do you intentionally connect with the community and design for and with communities is important.
Yeah, I think I just want to add to what Afua is saying. I agree with all of it. +1, +5, plus all of the numbers. And the other piece I want to go back to in the original question is the implication that technology is separate from the social impact sector, and that technologists themselves would be like over here, waiting to board the social impact bus and go to social impact land, right? And something that we talk about in the book, something that we have experienced in our own lives, is there are plenty of folks already working in social impact organizations, spaces, movements, whatever, that are emerging technologists themselves. And I think it's important to remember that so that we don't hold ourselves to an assumed definition of a technologist is like a very special, separate type of person, right? That like had very specific education or training or certification, qualifications, but really a technologist could be anyone that wants to take on the work and role of a technologist. I think even in our interviews with folks as we were writing the book, that was something that kept coming up, is really, while we talk about it as 5 kind of distinct groups and roles in the book, there's a real blur. You know, you can be a nonprofit organization that is funding technology, and you could have staff that are developing that technology, right? And when we really acknowledge all of that, it goes back to what we said at the very beginning. It's not simple, right? Like, we are at different times, all these different roles, and acknowledging the complexity will help us actually make more sense of it and move forward, instead of, you know, trying to think that we're only one thing forever, or that only certain groups have certain roles in how we work together.
That's great. Thank you. You mentioned education. So one of our superpowers here at the Beck Center is that we put students at the forefront of all our work. What advice do you have for undergraduate students interested in pursuing a field either in public interest tech or social impact at large that happen to enjoy technology?
My advice, I'll start first, and then Amy can follow with what I'm sure will be a much more eloquent answer. But my advice would be to just do it. If that is what you are interested in, do it. Figure out, something that you are passionate about today. It doesn't have to be something that you think you will be passionate about for the rest of your life, but something that is of interest for you today. Talk to other people in the space, figure out what some opportunities are in the space, and then do the work, and recognize that some of this work might require you to be the first there, to create a new path for yourself, to work with maybe an existing organization and help them see ways to do something a little differently, how they might want to change their process, how they might want to embrace the use of technology differently, how they might want to interact with policymakers differently. Might require you to start your own organization and figure out that path. And so I'd say for students that are interested in this work, know that you can start it today. There isn't some magical level of success that you must achieve at some point before you're allowed to do this public interest tech, this nonprofit tech work. There's not some magical level of expertise you need to have attained before you're allowed to suddenly start thinking about how might we change how we do technology, or how could I actually have a hand in that? Who do I need to have move first before I could do that? I'd encourage students to really think about what's a step I can take today. You might not change the entire world today, but you can take one step forward, and really thinking about what comes next for you, just what comes immediately next for you, and then just have the courage to step out and move forward there.
I do encourage people to change the whole world today, though. Like, I am also here for that level of change. I want to add, so just do it was going to be my answer too. So thank you for going first. Good answer. The second part of that I'll add for folks is think about this in the same way we're offering in the book, right? That this is community centered. You are yourself part of communities. You have identities, you have experiences. So if you're looking for, you're studying technology or you're studying whatever, and you're trying to think about where you might go or where you could contribute, think first about what communities you're already in, what identities you already have, because that will help root you in the real experience that you're trying to kind of build solutions around and with. And I think that's also a great way to find an organization, even if you're not looking to become a full-time staff member there, an aligned organization with your experience and your values, to be a volunteer or a board member or a contractor even, that's their technology partner, because you've started first with already being in that community, already sharing those identities and values. And that really sets you up, I think, for a more successful technology relationship too.
Great, thank you. The ideal future world that you write about and have obviously talked about in the past is connected and inclusive. When you were writing this book, did you think of any examples that exist today on a smaller scale that you would maybe reference as you were piecing this together?
Yes. Many examples. I think, the maybe less interesting but more honest answer for me is humans are complex. We were given a pretty blank slate and like, this is the world we made, y'all. Okay. So not great track record on good planning. So that is also the reality of like looking at examples. There are organizations, even organizations we're part of, right, where there's like such good examples of something, and then also something where we're like, oh God, if only that piece wasn't there, right? Like, because humans are involved in all of these things. So there's going to be complex situations, complex case studies. Even, a number of the case studies in the book, like the longer full case studies, include statements like, wouldn't it be great if this wasn't a case study because this was normal, right? Or wouldn't it be great if this case study was like where they were 10 years ago and they had gotten further than this versus this is kind of where they are now, right? So yes, there are so many great examples and movements and technologies, happening, but also they're part of this complex, challenging world that we're in. And so all of them can also continue to move forward and evolve.
Yeah, and obviously plus 100 to everything Amy just said. I think, in the book we have two images. We have one image of sort of a visual depiction of the silos and the closed offness, if that's a word that I'm making up now, of our world today when it comes to access to technology, when it comes to communication, when it comes to information and power sharing. And we have a second image that depicts a world that's much more inclusive, that doesn't have silos, that has access to resources, whether those are natural resources or to financial resources or to community resources, and has space for people to operate and to connect with each other. And so humans connecting to humans. And so I think that is another thing that we kept in mind as we were writing this book, is sort of, when we say an equitable world, what does that mean? It's something that's inclusive, something where people have access, something where information flows and power is shared. And so I think that's something else that we kept in mind while writing the book.
Great. When I was reading the book, I personally really enjoyed the list of questions you had at the end of each chapter for different stakeholders, whether technologists, people working directly in social impact, policymakers, questions to really think about and help answer to understand the concepts that you're introducing. How do you both think about building culture within an organization where asking those questions constantly becomes just part of what you do and automatic?
I love talking about culture because I kind of think it's like the hardest to shift, but also if you can shift it, the most influential on where you can go, right? Because culture, when we're talking about organizational culture or team culture, whatever kind of team it is, it doesn't have to be a nonprofit. We're talking about norms and values and ways of engaging with each other that set up actual relationship, actual accountability. So that we'll just spend the rest of the time talking about that. I'm good with that. But I think, a big piece of that is remembering that while culture of the team or organization is people, a lot of it comes down to structures that people can reference to help remind them of, what is our process, right? So I think sometimes folks get caught up in thinking, oh, culture change is like how we talk in meetings. Yes, it is, right? But it's also, how did you know to have a meeting? Who got to be invited to that meeting? How did people know that they could or could not contribute to the agenda of that meeting, right? So remembering that your org culture is kind of like a tree, right? So it can only be maintained, all those other branches, all those people, if there is a structure to support them. And I don't want folks to kind of like swing the pendulum really far the other way into like really white dominant culture of, everything has to be written down. And if it's written down once, like that's now the way we do it here, right? But remembering there's a little bit of leeway there. If it isn't written down, it isn't accessible to other people. Other folks that don't know it. And that can be real barriers to changing your culture or having an engaging culture. So making sure that folks think about, okay, if we're working on like, what's our organization's culture around technology projects, something that N10 has done research on is actually a lot of organizations say not everyone in the organization even knows how a technology project gets to happen. Well, if people don't know, they're never starting one, right? And so then you've already kind of stopped your organization's culture being very engaging around technology projects. So do you have a, whatever you use, an intranet, a wiki, a staff resource guide, whatever you have in your organization, like, are there a couple steps you can write down? Hey, does your team need a tech project? Here's how to get that started, right? Here's the resources the organization has for technology budgets in any given year, whatever those pieces might be. So again, not like you're writing down the rules of everything, but you're writing down the structure so folks know how and where to engage, because that, I think, really accelerates the human side of culture change, people then being able to have the knowledge and move forward and engage with each other.
Absolutely. And I think just building on what Amy said, I think of it really in three buckets. When we're looking at changing any organization or empowering organizations, we always want to think about it in the terms of technology, people, and process. So what technology is there? Do you have access to? Do you need to get access to in support of your mission and to really advance your mission? The people part of that, what language are we using with each other? Do we have diverse communities represented on our staff? Are we caring for some of the emotional feelings that are attached to things like change, and to things like the work that needs to get done, and to things like the issues that come up or the issues that your organization is working on? And then process, as Amy said, structure is so important. It's important to let your staffs, your teams, to spend their energy actually doing work and doing good work, rather than to spend their time thinking about, now, who do I need to bring in to make a decision about this? Who do I need to talk to figure out, can I move forward on this project? Can I not move forward on this project? Who do I need to do this? If you can define some of those processes more clearly and work on that process angle, the people angle, as well as the how to sort of care for individuals who are there, and then that technology piece, when you can do that all together, I think you can really strengthen the culture of your organization.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I love the emphasis on that structure to enable really everything else. That's great. You mentioned a couple of these organizations in the book, but I'm curious how you think about the balance between social impact focused arms like google.org, Okta for Good, Airbnb.org, balancing those groups with their parent companies, for-profit companies that may directly contribute to some of these closed and inequitable systems. I
would invite us to let go of may contribute and just acknowledge that they do contribute. Because they are, like, we also, like, we are all here, right? Even if we didn't sign up for the game, it's the game we're playing. And we have to like have a level of acknowledgement. Otherwise, we're never really going to change that game, right? We're never going to engage with it. It's interesting, the like for good arm of a for-profit entity, because at least in my experience, there's like no two that are the same or define what for good is, right? Like some of them true classic CSR, some of them actual foundations, some of them giving out money, some of them giving you the product, right? And we all know we're the product, right? So I think there's a challenge, and we kind of address this at the very beginning of the book, because we ourselves were even challenged when we were trying to come up with like, what is the language we use? And we came to social impact organizations, not because that is a great term, totally accept it is not a great term, but a nonprofit is a tax status, right? And a US tax status. Saying charity really is also a tax status in other areas, but also like a word that we have got to do some unpacking around, right? So we came to that term actually knowing that it would, depending on the organization and the reader, maybe include some of those for good entities too, right? And again, not because we want things to be simple, we want to acknowledge and actually create the container for them to be complex and for there to be multiple roles at any time. Even within the social impact organizations chapter, we're talking about how a social impact organization invests in its own technology, as well as interacts with technology vendors or providers that are external to the organization. So as we think about those entities who have both a for good and a for all, or whatever the other side would be categorized as, I think part of the invitation of the book is to invite a little introspection on why they are separate. Of course, they're separate for like tax loopholes, but from a programmatic and values and mission perspective, why are they separate, right? And can there be a way to bring them closer together, even if capitalism still requires you have 3 different entities, on your P&L for who knows what reason? And there are examples of that, right? Like we do talk about Octave for Good in the funders chapter as an organization who created that for good piece because the main organization was already committed to that. And that was part of their values of what they wanted to do with the company, versus like, we can all think of lots of examples where there's a company that exists for a long time. And then later there's like let's add on a little for good salt at the end of this recipe, and that also changes what they're considering the work of that effort to be. And especially when it's a technology company, it means the technology is probably not for the social impact organizations, right? It is a way to try and offer something in the end versus building for those groups intentionally from the beginning.
Again, just echo everything Amy said, which is probably why we decided to write a book together, because we are aligned on many of these topics and the questions that you're asking, George. I think, though, what I might add is that even though, you mentioned there's the for good arm and then there's the regular arm of the company, oftentimes the technology that both arms support affects people in the social impact sector, in the world in general. And so I think it's important to remember that and to really then encourage both sides to think intentionally about how technology is designed and deployed.
Great. So toward the end, you write about the need for both physical and mental space while tackling some of these challenges, space to imagine, space to try new things, and space to rest. As both being active practitioners in this current hybrid, figuring out what's next world, how and where do you find your space?
This was really advice we wrote for other people. No, I'm just kidding. It is incredibly important to take this work. I think one of the things that I think I have found in my experience, Amy has probably found in their experience, and I think we heard in a lot of the interviews we had as we were writing this book, as we were preparing to write this book, is that this work can be challenging. It takes a long time often. It requires a lot of effort and a lot of continued focus in order to see these changes, to make progress against some of the large social issues. And so when you frame it like that, when you recognize that a lot of this work is for the long haul, of course, if the social impact organizations, some of the nonprofit organizations execute on their mission, they won't need to exist anymore. But until then, it does take a lot of effort. It is important that we do treat staff appropriately. We recognize that people doing work in this space, public interest technologists, nonprofit employees, or whatever term you're using to define yourself, are prepared for that long haul. So it means allowing space for people to take breaks, to make sure people use PTO, for example, that simple thing, allowing people space and encouraging interest and things outside of that mission. So what balance looks like. And I think that looks a little differently for everyone. For me, it is baking, cooking on a very practical level, and spending some time with my family. And so it's, finding what works for you and making sure that process-wise and system-wise, back to the culture conversation, as we lead these organizations, we're making sure to build in processes for people to have some of the mental space they need to do the work well.
I would love to benefit from Afua's baking, but I do not find my renewal in baking. I think a big piece for me, and this shows up even in the book too, we talk about, we need to make sure that our relationship to technology is appropriate, that we are not, looking on high to technology to save us. Like, it won't save us, y'all. We built this problematic technology ourselves. So that, I think, really has a mirror in my own life. To answer your question about finding place to rest and imagine other things, is I find a lot of value in places where there is not technology, like going for a walk in the woods, and remembering, like, we are on a spinning rock filled with beauty that does not require any programming other than like nature's programming of when the rain comes, right? So finding space and access to space where it is not all Zoom calls and Slack messages and emails helps me when I come back to all those Zoom calls and come back to all those Slack messages, right? Like, I'm able to keep them in the priority that they're meant to be, like, about the people I'm interacting with there, but not because like my life is only the technology. I think that's really important and has been true, I think, my whole career, because the trap is real. Like, the trap to just be in technology is so strong. And I've had to find, some like intentional ways to close that laptop. Otherwise, you just fall into the trap. I'm like now picturing a physical trap, but I don't mean it that way. It is truly metaphorical.
A cubicle's a trap. Great. I see we have a question in the chat from Lucy. Amy, if you want to start answering that, I know you responded.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just read Lucy's question for folks. Lucy said, you mentioned facial recognition. I don't know if everybody heard that reference, but Afua mentioned it earlier on in the conversation. I'm curious if you've come across examples where communities don't want a technology or don't believe technology is the answer, and what technologists' role and responsibilities are in that space. I'll buy some time for Afua's good, thoughtful example answer, but I'll share an example. I'm based here in Portland, Oregon, and we have had some municipal level policy conversations over the last, always, but specifically, I'm thinking of some over the last kind of 4-ish years, specific to the city's use and contracts that involve facial recognition technology, whether that's being used by police or other groups. And we have actually made some progress where those are not able to be used, and that was because of technologists and community members working together to hold a series of conversations where we were really talking about, like, what are we doing here? Like, what is the goal that we were solving with facial recognition technology, and getting to peel back those layers and start at, like, what are we trying to do? What is the goal? What are we valuing? And how are we making sure that really diverse communities across our city are part of these conversations, so that by the time, the feedback and the recommendations come back to city council, it is not, here's the best tool on the market and here's the pricing for it, right? It's, here are the harms that are going to come to community members that need to be addressed. Maybe technology is still somewhere in what we decide is the solution, but that's only after we have very clearly addressed harms, potential impacts, et cetera, right? So I just want to offer that as an example, because technologists were really important in those community engagement sessions, because especially talking about facial recognition, any sort of surveillance technology, people have a lot of fear and a lot of stress that is very founded and very real. But it can make it so that folks don't come to the conversation, or that they come to the conversation and are never able to get past, maybe certain misunderstandings or myths of how to even talk about what it is. So they're not really fully providing feedback because they might think it's a very narrowly defined idea, right? So technologists were critical, making sure that they could, explain fully what the implications of a certain technology, some of our conversations were a specific tool, some were about, where does your data go? That's a really complex conversation, especially for folks who aren't used to thinking about the word data, right? Like they're thinking about who has my email, who has my phone number, who knows my demographics. So I think technologists sometimes think, oh, we're over here like building this tool, right? Sometimes the most important role of a technologist is as a translator and a liaison, being able to fully understand a topic or a tool so well that you can make it not such a technical jargon for other folks to engage in.
Yeah, just 100% to everything Amy just said. I think that one of the core themes throughout our book is community focused is the way to go. And so I think we can reject the notion somewhat, if not totally, that technologists aren't empowered to make changes, aren't empowered to start out with one thing and then to change. The entire scientific process, in fact, is built on the assumption that if the hypothesis at first doesn't work, then you pivot and you try again. And so let's apply that more explicitly to technology. On a more practical level, at the end of each chapter on each different role in the book, we do list some questions for people to ask. And so questions for technologists to ask of community members to really understand, how do we move forward? Are we meeting the right needs? If not, how do we start to change that? And for policymakers to understand, for funders to understand as well, how to ask those questions and to start those conversations.
Great. Just quick reminder for the audience, please, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. I do have one, selfishly related to the Beck Center and the work we do. Curious how you think about organizations like ours and how we can play a role in this, based at a university in the academic sector, but still focused on the community and external partners.
I think the Beck Center, being at Georgetown and with the role and position that the Beck Center has crafted, is uniquely positioned to really help train people on how to do this. I know the Beck Center works with leaders of a lot of state governments and local governments. And so really, as we talk about policymakers, supporting policymakers and using technology, supporting policymakers and understanding technology and the policies that communities want to design around that, supporting policymakers and how to communicate with the communities and their constituents, and what that process might look like, what it might look like to tweak policies, to design policies from the start with that community impact is important. I know that one of the reports of the Beck Center on a user-centered policy design process we have listed on our book website under our resources tab for people who are thinking about how to do this work. So I think the Beck Center continuing to do that work and to really do more of that, I think, is an opportunity. And then, of course, as you mentioned earlier, George, Beck Center putting students first, putting students at the forefront. And so really empowering people to, again, start practicing this work today, but to really see ways to have careers doing this work, to really see ways of how do we take community-centered solutions, how do we take new ways of developing tech, designing tech, and just relating to technology into whatever careers they decide to pursue after they leave the university.
Yeah, I think any organization, Beck Center included, but like also any organization, can always be asking what organizational privileges you have, right? Sometimes that's positional power, like you could convene people that maybe other organizations couldn't, but also you're resourced in ways that other organizations aren't. So thinking about it from that perspective kind of alleviates, like, who do I personally know, but who does my organization know, and how does that organization, kind of operate? And I think something, back to our previous question about how do we make space for rest? How do we make space for imagining different ways of working together? That comes from organizations who have privilege to create that space and that convening in an intersectional way. Of course, there's an organization who, maybe works over in a certain topic area. They don't have a lot of partners. That's still great. They can still be doing that work. But Beck Center, organizations that operate across all these different groups and sectors and processes are really critical conveners in that way, because when you say, hey, the Beck Center is going to like create this afternoon for imagining a different world, so many different people might end up in that room that it creates, I think, a lot more possibility to generate different ideas than if it was only a certain, group of people from a very specific community. Still valuable for them to have that space, but you all can kind of really lean into this intersection that you have across different industries and sectors, and that's valuable.
Yeah, I love that you highlight that convening. We also see that as one of our main roles and our powers. And you've interviewed many organizations in the writing of this book, and I know in your day jobs, you interact with a diverse set of organizations. What are some techniques you've found to be useful to find the people doing this work and make sure we're finding that diverse set of voices? Because as you know, particularly at Georgetown and in DC, it's easy to be siloed and easy to only look at one small subsection.
Yeah, I think about some of the very idealistic, but need some work rules back when, I don't know if you all remember when we used to do unconferences and the rules of unconference. One of them is the people that showed up were the right people. And I think that is really a great rule to apply to your question, knowing that the only way that you can trust that the right people, came, is that you did a lot of work to make sure that the space, the venue, the container, the event, whatever, was actually accessible to all of those groups. Accessible physically, like people could get there, but also accessible in all the other ways, that it was a space folks saw themselves in and invited to, a space that folks saw they had the ability to contribute and shape. So doing a lot of that groundwork. And then, yeah, the people that came were the right people, because we don't need to put these expectations on our imagining time together that like, this was the one time. If it didn't happen on April 7th, the world will not be changed. Like this should be always like the latest conversation towards that end, not the last conversation. And so relieving some of that pressure also allows you, I think, to say, yeah, these were the right people for April 7th, right? And April 8th can be a different group of people, and we can continue to evolve that.
I love what Amy said, is that this is the latest conversation, and just really adopting that mindset. I think I would also encourage organizations with convening powers, such as the Beck Center, to really find the time and put in the work. It's quite simple, but not, in that you need to find the time and dedicate the time for doing outreach, to allow enough time to have those conversations, to get people on board, to get people interested, to find the right people, to find the right people who can recommend the right people for you to actually then talk to then invite the right people to the convening. And so really finding the time for all of those conversations and then putting in the work. It is a lot of work sometimes to make things accessible to different populations. It can be a lot of work sometimes to find funding so that people can actually take time off of their jobs to attend convenings, for example. It can be a lot of work just logistically to manage conversation flow and more if you have a lot of different groups represented. But finding the time and putting in the work is what you can do to facilitate strong convenings.
Love that. Thank you. Looking ahead a little bit, what do you see as in the next maybe 10 years as the biggest change that we're going to see in this space, either aspirationally or maybe realistically?
I think one change that we're already starting to see, but I think if we're thinking about 10 years from now, is I think there will be far more understanding and instances of folks inside of organizations or movements or coalitions building the solutions that they need for themselves versus what has been historically more of a reliance or even just a myth in our minds that we've adopted that like technology is created outside of the sector. We already see that happening more and more, but part of the evolution of technology is that like you don't have to start from scratch and like build a platform, right? Like oh, you already have a website, you're halfway there. Just add this like open source plugin that you found, and like now your website does this other thing, right? And I think that's awesome, but I think it will challenge organizations to be far more intentional than I think a lot of them have been in the past about how we budget for technology, how we think of what technology is, right? It's not separate. It is like integrated in our program delivery. It is required for our mission to even happen in 2022. So changing that, as well as changing how do we hire and train our staff? How do we make sure that we're investing in staff's knowledge of technology, not the IT team, but literally every staff person is a technology staff person, right? Everyone is using technology and can and should be part of helping create those solutions, or identifying at least what direction and decisions the organization should make with technology.
Absolutely. I also think looking 10 years from now, I think that sort of power and ownership structures, especially in technology and social impact organizations, I think those will look different than they look now. I think that especially over the past couple of years, and hopefully this trend continues, you've seen more people feeling qualified or finding funding in order to take on social challenges, to build structures that serve them, to advance different social issues, and what that then looks like for different movements that are moving forward, different technologies that are being developed, or different ways technology is supporting different movements. And so I think over the next 10 years, we'll continue to see that shift occur, so that power and ownership looks a little different than it looks today.
Great, thanks. I think obviously this is a great partnership, a great book and product. I'm curious, do you have plans for the next? Is there a sequel? Is there an additional thing you want to create together?
I mean, an equitable world, we're going to create that together, but we did not sign like a 3-part deal for the trilogy of how we do that work. I think, we say at the end of the book and on the book website, but our hope is like what we do next is even more than just Afua and I, right? It's like lots of us together saying, oh, what if we tried this? What if we built something this way? What if we started asking questions like this? And we don't have any preconceived format that has to happen in. And maybe, 10 years from now, we're doing this Zoom again on whatever it's called 10 years from now. And we have written another book, maybe, but George, we just wrote this one. Like, what is with all of this pressure? We need to breathe a little.
Fair. You need to find space. I understand.
Exactly. I just again echo what Amy said. We are creating space for ourselves in this world as we actively also work for building an equitable world. But really, as Amy said, we're hoping these ideas are bigger than just Amy and myself and the probably 36 people we quoted in the book, that more and more people think about how can they really engage with this idea of how we build a more equitable world. What does that look like for you in your world, and with the techniques that you have at your hand, and what levers you can pull yourself, and what new things you can imagine. Amy and I probably didn't write down every single detail for what a more equitable world will look like. And so hopefully, folks on this call and others will be able to dream even bigger than we did, and help work towards that.
A couple details still to be defined,
That's great. I love that. Afua, Amy, thank you again for taking the time. This has been fantastic. For everybody that doesn't know what it looks like, this is the book. I encourage everyone to read it. We're giving away 30 free copies to the first 30 participants today. And we'll have it at the Beck Center, of course. It'll be on my desk personally. So I encourage everyone to read it, internalize a lot of the lessons and examples, and work as a team to move forward. So thank you again.
Thanks so much, George.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your week.